It's a huge amount of time. In some ways it feels like it was only a few weeks ago, and other times it's felt really long. But it is a hard marker of time.
And you referred to it on your website as stolen time.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's time that we should have had with Madeleine. We should have been a family of 5 for all that time. And yeah, it does feel stolen.
We tried everything in our power to not have a long, protracted missing person case like this.
When 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared in Portugal in 2007, the world rallied behind her family. Within days, the Leaving No Stone Unturned Fund was created, presented as a moral mission to find a missing child and bring justice. Donations poured in, raising millions. Yet nearly 2 decades later, there has been no justice, no clear answers, and little transparency. Instead, the fund has become, in the eyes of many, a symbol of privilege and careful narrative control. Mortgage payments, failed private detective efforts, legal battles to protect reputations. This is how much of the money was used. Meanwhile, countless other families of missing children received nothing of the sort. Public frustration grew, fueled by suspicions of high-level protection and media spin. This investigation asks whether a fund created to uncover truth may instead have shielded power, concealed shortcomings, and betrayed the trust of those who gave so willingly. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. It took just 12 days. On the 15th of May 2007, less than 2 weeks after Madeleine vanished from a holiday resort in Portugal, her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, launched the fund. It was fast, emotional, and well-branded. Yet from the outset, it raised questions. The fund was not registered as a charity, but as a private limited company in London. Its goals sounded noble: to find Madeleine, to bring those responsible to justice, and to provide financial support during the search. But why not a charity? Because UK law does not allow charitable status for causes focused solely on one individual. That technicality became the fund's greatest protection. Without charity status, it was not bound by the same transparency rules or independent oversight. There were no external watchdogs, no tight audits, only a grieving family, a circle of trusted allies, and nearly £2 million in donations arriving in the first year. Public sympathy was immense. Madeleine's disappearance shocked the world, and her parents, respected doctors who left their jobs to focus on the search, became the center of a powerful emotional story. Donations reached almost £1.85 million in that first year. People believed they were directly helping a family desperate to find their missing child. But the structure of the fund meant something very different. At its core, it was run like a business rather than a public cause. The board included Kate and Gerry themselves, and close associates such as wealthy businessman Brian Kennedy. There were no independent directors, no neutral overseers. Those controlling the narrative also controlled the money. This overlap raised serious concerns once the spending began. Mortgage payments, public relations consultants, failed private investigators, international trips, and lawsuits to protect the family's reputation were all covered, at least in part, by the fund. Yet no measurable progress was made in finding Madeleine, and no external body held anyone accountable, despite promises that unused funds would eventually go toward helping other missing children. That never happened. As of 2024, Madeleine remains missing, and the fund still holds over £900,000. For many donors, the deepest sense of betrayal lay not in how the money was spent, but in what was never explained. Most believed their donations were going directly toward the search. Instead, they had been financing a private operation with minimal oversight. The McCanns did not break the law, but they bent public trust, and for many, that was worse. The urgency of the case allowed the fund to grow quickly and without scrutiny, but its very structure made it resistant to questioning. From polished press conferences to high-profile legal defenses, every element of its design concentrated control in the hands of a small group and kept critics firmly outside. True crime is not only about victims, it is also about what happens to truth. In this case, the truth about the fund, the money, and the decisions made in its name was sealed behind legal protections and media sympathy. Nearly 2 decades later, while the world still asks where Madeleine is, another question grows louder. What, ultimately, was this fund protecting? On the surface, the leadership of the fund looked professional. Kate and Gerry McCann were central, joined by multimillionaire Brian Kennedy, accountant Michael Lynette, lawyer Edward Smethurst, and media producer John Corner. On paper, this appeared to combine financial, legal, and media expertise. In practice, however, it meant every decision rested with people personally invested in the outcome. No independent voices, no impartial scrutiny. In any other context, it would be considered a textbook conflict of interest. Here, it was simply accepted as the fund, and the money was significant from the start. Between 2007 and 2008, the fund raised nearly £1.85 million, £1.4 million through bank donations, £39,000 online, £64,000 through merchandise like bracelets and t-shirts bearing Madeleine's face. But the most striking donations came from power and celebrity. The News of the World contributed £25,000, Sir Philip Green the same, Simon Cowell added £5,000, Richard Branson donated £100,000 to cover legal fees, and both J.K. Rowling and theatre mogul Bill Kenwright also gave undisclosed sums. These endorsements brought more than money. They brought media protection, legal strength, and a narrative increasingly shielded from criticism. The fund's financial muscle extended beyond donations. The McCanns successfully sued for libel, winning payouts that were channeled back into the fund. By 2024, almost 17 years later, the fund still held over £920,000. Much of this now comes not from fresh donations, but from royalties, including Kate McCann's book, Madeleine, which once generated tens of thousands annually, but by 2022-2023 had dwindled to under £35. For a fund born of crisis, one might expect money to spark new leads or breakthroughs, yet the trail remains cold. No new suspects, no major developments, just steady income held under the control of the same people, with little outside accountability. It is a cruel irony. The same emotional urgency and celebrity endorsements that fueled the fund's growth also ensured it was nearly impossible to question. What began as a symbol of determination has become, to many, a symbol of control. From the outset, the fund operated in a legal grey zone, permitted under the law, but dangerously opaque. While it claimed to follow principles of good governance, it deliberately avoided the one system of accountability that might have ensured real transparency: charity regulation. Without being a registered charity, it faced no mandatory audits, no strict reporting rules, and no obligation to disclose how donations were used. For a fund handling millions in public money, this was less a loophole and more a shield. No clear records, no regular updates. And only at the end of the 2007-2008 fiscal year did Companies House release a full financial report. By then, public questions had already begun to mount, and the answers were troubling. That report revealed what few expected. Some of the fund's earliest spending had gone towards paying the McCann's mortgage. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Thousands had donated in the belief they were helping to find a missing child, not to cover the parents' personal expenses. The fund's deliberately vague wording about supporting the family became a convenient umbrella for expenditures that felt increasingly difficult to justify. Although the McCanns later agreed to stop using the fund for personal financial support after being named formal suspects in Portugal, the damage to public trust had already been done. What made matters worse was the composition of the board itself. As noted before, the directors were family members, close friends, and personal allies. There were no independent reviewers, no external watchdogs, no impartial oversight. Every decision was kept within the inner circle. This was not simply poor governance. It appeared to be a structure deliberately built to avoid dissent. That lack of independent scrutiny did more than raise eyebrows. It created the foundation for nearly 2 decades of controversy. From mortgage payments to costly PR campaigns and questionable legal battles, every round of spending reignited the same questions. The absence of transparency at the beginning remained the root cause of suspicion for years to come. In the world of true crime, it is not just about what is done. It is also about what can be hidden. The Madeleine Fund, by its very design, made hiding easy. From the outside, it appeared a lifeline. But once details emerged, many felt deceived. Donations intended for a child's search had quietly trickled into personal comforts, failed investigations, media management, and courtroom battles. Perhaps the most inflammatory revelation came in 2007, when it was disclosed that the fund had been used to pay £2,000 per month toward 2 mortgages on the McCann's home in Rothley, Leicestershire. At the time, Kate and Gerry were on unpaid leave from their medical roles to focus on the case, and supporters may initially have sympathized until they realized their donations were covering family bills rather than investigative leads. The backlash was immediate and severe. People had not sent their savings, pensions, or spare cash to cover a mortgage. They had given in the hope of bringing a missing child home. Although the fund's mission statement included supporting the family, most assumed that meant logistical help or investigative costs, not monthly bills. Critics argued this blurred the priorities. Was it about rescuing Madeleine or about preserving lifestyle? Timing only worsened the controversy. In September 2007, the McCanns were declared arguido, official suspects, by Portuguese police. Within days, and under growing pressure, they announced they would no longer use the fund for personal financial support. But by then, the mortgage issue had cast a long shadow over every spending decision that followed. Desperate for progress, the McCanns turned to Metodo 3, a private detective agency based in Spain. Over 10 months, the fund spent £250,000 on their services. The firm promised quick results, even boldly predicting Madeleine would be found by Christmas. They claimed to have insider knowledge and underworld connections. Yet their methods were unorthodox, their credibility shaky, and their results non-existent. In the end, even the McCanns admitted disappointment, and the contract was quietly terminated. For donors, this was not just failure, it was waste. £250,000 had vanished with no new evidence, no arrests, and no meaningful progress. Why wasn't more care taken before hiring such an agency? Why weren't established experts consulted? For many, this was a breach of trust. Public donations funding unvetted promises instead of professional investigation. Another major spending area was public relations. In the early months, nearly £82,000 went into media campaigns, newspaper adverts, TV spots, posters plastered across Europe. Later, a further £133,000 was spent on campaign management, including the salary of spokesperson Justine McGuinness. Eventually, Clarence Mitchell, a former government PR official, was brought in as a full-time communications advisor. His salary was reportedly covered by donor Brian Kennedy, but the overall PR strategy became highly controversial. Supporters initially welcomed the visibility, but as time passed, critics accused the campaign of focusing more on protecting the McCann's image than on finding their daughter. Emotional appeals, carefully staged press conferences, and legal threats against tabloids increasingly portrayed the family as the primary victims, rather than keeping attention on Madeleine herself. Public sentiment began to shift. Was the fund being used to find a child, or to manage a reputation? The line blurred until it all but disappeared. The PR blitz may have won sympathy in the media, but it cost the fund its moral high ground. In 2022-2023, the fund also paid nearly £6,700 in legal fees for a lawsuit against Gonçalo Amaral, the former Portuguese detective who had led the original investigation. Amaral had published a book claiming that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents staged an abduction. The McCanns sued for libel. But not only did the lawsuit fail, the fact that fund money was used to pursue it provoked public outrage. Donors felt their contributions had not been meant to silence critics, but to search for a child. Even many who sympathized with the family questioned this decision. In their eyes, this was the point at which the fund slid further into private legal weaponry. The continued presence of Clarence Mitchell as advisor during this period only deepened suspicions that the fund was less about justice and more about controlling the story. Each of these expenditures might be defended in isolation, but when seen together, they formed a troubling pattern. A fund created in crisis, but increasingly used in ways that diverged from public expectation. The problem was not just in how the money was spent. It was in the silence, the absence of transparency, the refusal to allow outside scrutiny. In a case so heavily built on emotion, the fund became a reflection of public fear. That power protects itself, that privilege insulates, and that justice can be quietly smothered by bureaucracy and spin. The central question remains: how much of those donations truly searched for Madeleine, and how much served to protect everyone else? In cases of missing children, the public does not simply donate money. They invest hope. When people gave to the Madeleine Fund, they were not just sending cash to strangers. They were clinging to a belief that truth matters, and that justice would be pursued with determination and without compromise. That belief, many now feel, was squandered. The outrage was not only about the sums of money, but about what those choices represented. Paying a mortgage while a child remained missing seemed grotesquely out of touch to many. Suing a former detective with an alternative theory looked like silencing dissent rather than seeking truth. Pouring six-figure sums into media campaigns in Morocco and Spain, regions that produced no concrete leads, felt less like investigation and more like reputation management. The emotional toll was heavy. Donors described feeling exploited. Parents of other missing children expressed quiet anger, asking why one family had received so much financial and media support, only to channel it inward. Families of victims such as Ben Needham and Joanna Cipriano pointed out the stark double standard, questioning why their tragedies never inspired the same level of funding or protection. Other families in similar tragedies received no glossy posters, no international press tours, no million-pound PR budgets, just silence. And then there was the silence from the fund itself. No clear apology, No real explanation, no acknowledgement that decisions made in a moment of crisis had damaged the very community that had once rallied in support. Ethically, this silence became the loudest betrayal. The fund had been presented as a mission of justice, but instead functioned like a fortress. True crime is not only about what happens in the shadows. It is also about the systems that fail us in plain sight. In the case of the Madeleine Fund, the deepest harm was not only financial but moral, leaving an open wound not just in the hearts of donors but in wider public faith that truth, transparency, and justice can still coexist. The controversy around the fund cannot be viewed in isolation. Its impact, financial, ethical, and emotional, resonates even more strongly when set beside other child disappearance cases that received little or no support. These comparisons are not just uncomfortable, they are damning. They expose a systemic inequality in how cases are handled, whose suffering is acknowledged, and whose is overlooked. To grasp the scale of the disparity, one must ask, what if Madeleine had not been white, British, and from a professional middle-class family with parents skilled at handling the media? What if her name had been Ben Needham or Shannon Matthews? Ben Needham disappeared from the Greek island of Kos in 1991 at just 21 months old. His mother, Kerry Needham, fought tirelessly for years to keep her son's name alive. She pleaded for recognition, for support, for government help, but her campaign never triggered an international movement. There was no multi-million-pound fund, no celebrity endorsements, no Operation Grange. When the McCann case exploded in 2007, Kerry spoke out, cautiously but painfully. She expressed admiration for the McCann's ability to mobilize such resources, but pointed to the stark imbalance. Why had her son's life not merited the same urgency? When she compared the treatment of the two cases, she was criticized and even accused of jealousy. Yet all she had done was highlight an obvious truth. Justice should never be a popularity contest. 3 years before Madeleine vanished, another child, 8-year-old Joanna Cipriano, disappeared just 16 kilometers from Praia da Luz. Her mother, Leonor Cipriano, was quickly accused and later convicted of involvement in her daughter's disappearance, despite Joanna's body never being found, and despite the case being plagued by allegations of police misconduct. Unlike the McCanns, Leonor received no benefit of the doubt, no wave of public sympathy, no legal defense campaigns. Why the stark difference? Joanna's family was working class, Portuguese, without wealth, connections, or media access. Her mother became the convenient suspect. For many in Portugal, the contrast between Joanna's case and Madeleine's became a symbol of injustice rooted in class and status. 2 missing girls, but only one considered worthy of protection. Placed side by side, these cases highlight a grim truth. Media coverage, government resources, and public sympathy often follow not the severity of a case, but the social identity of those involved. Madeleine's disappearance became a global cause partly because it had all the right ingredients: a photogenic child, articulate professional parents, connections to influence, and a narrative that resonated emotionally across borders. In contrast, Ben's family were largely forgotten, and Joanna's family condemned. This raises an unsettling ethical question. Was the Madeleine Fund ever truly about justice for all children? Or was it about preserving a specific narrative, one that worked because the victims looked a certain way, lived a certain way, and spoke a certain way? The public does not want to believe that justice is selective, but such comparisons make it difficult to conclude otherwise. The unequal treatment of these cases exposes more than media bias. It exposes a systemic failure. For many, the Madeleine Fund became a lightning rod, not only because of how it spent its money, but because of how much money it had compared to cases that received nothing. It is not wrong to help grieving parents, but it is wrong to help some parents more than others based on how comfortable their tragedy makes us feel. In true crime, the greatest silence is not always where the victim lies. Sometimes it is in the stories that were never told. From the moment Clarence Mitchell entered the scene, the Madeleine McCann case changed tone. A former government press officer with links to the Cabinet Office and the government's media monitoring unit, Mitchell was no ordinary PR consultant. He was effectively a voice of authority. His salary was reportedly covered by wealthy donor Brian Kennedy, already a board member of the fund. The message was clear. The McCanns were not simply devastated parents. They had political-grade crisis management behind them. Mitchell's presence reframed the narrative. The raw emotion of a grieving family gave way to controlled press briefings, carefully managed statements, and a relentless effort to shape public opinion.
Critics were portrayed as insensitive, Portuguese police as incompetent, and alternative theories as attacks to be suppressed. To many observers, it felt less like a search for truth and more like damage control. This degree of media orchestration is highly unusual in missing person cases, as is the level of state involvement that followed. In 2011, 4 years after Madeleine disappeared, the UK government launched Operation Grange, a Scotland Yard reinvestigation. By 2024, it had cost more than £13.2 million in public funds, a figure greater than the combined costs of multiple terrorism investigations and serial crime cases. Such an extraordinary allocation of resources without clear breakthroughs raised serious questions. Why this case? Why at such expense? And what was the true motive? Some pointed to political pressure. The case had become an international embarrassment and a source of tension between British and Portuguese authorities. Reopening it allowed the UK government to regain narrative control and reassure the public that everything possible was being done. Others saw it as a gesture to placate outrage, a costly PR exercise designed to project competence rather than deliver results. Whatever the motive, the message to other families was stark. Unless your tragedy makes headlines, do not expect this level of help. The combination of Clarence Mitchell's polished spin and Operation Grange's unprecedented budget created the perception that the McCann case was not being handled like others, because the McCanns were not being treated like other parents. They had political insulation, media protection, and extraordinary financial resources. Increasingly, they also faced public suspicion. While many families of missing children struggled to print a poster, the McCanns operated with tools and access most could never imagine. The contrast was not only sharp, it was profoundly unsettling. And the spending went far beyond legal fees. The fund covered international campaigns and high-profile appearances in Madrid, Amsterdam, Berlin, Washington, D.C., and Rabat. These were not modest trips. They were strategic media events designed to keep Madeleine's name in the headlines and the family at the center of global sympathy. But again, these opportunities were never available to the Needhams or the Ciprianos, whose cases faded into obscurity while one remained a permanent feature of the international stage. This level of mobility, legal, political, and geographical, was unprecedented. For many observers, the most troubling question was whether the Madeleine McCann case was being elevated because of the facts or because of who her parents were and the connections they had. This was not simply about financial resources, it was about what those resources enabled: elite PR support, international influence, legal victories, and direct access to government officials. For most families, the pursuit of justice is like navigating a maze. For the McCanns, at times it seemed more like a red carpet. That disparity fueled resentment and suspicion over the years.
not always directed at the McCanns themselves, but at a system that appeared to bend around them. When justice begins to look like a privilege of visibility and influence, the public naturally asks, was the game rigged before it even began? The case was not propelled only by grassroots donations. It was also elevated by support and funding from some of Britain's most influential figures. This wasn't simply a matter of charity. It was elite sponsorship, and it changed the landscape entirely. But prestige comes with strings. As the money and endorsements poured in, so did questions. Were these contributions acts of compassion, or were they also strategic moves? Funding the McCanns did more than aid a grieving family. It shaped the narrative itself. It framed the McCanns as ideal victims, respectable, educated, middle class, and now publicly endorsed by celebrities and powerful backers. This carefully curated image was strengthened by professional PR management and financed by those who had reputations of their own to protect. In this sense, donations were not just about generosity, they were also about perception. In Britain's tightly woven network of politics, media, and wealth, managing public image is its own form of currency. The McCanns were not just clients of PR firms. They became symbols of national resilience, of family under siege. Supporting them meant aligning with a cause the public was encouraged to accept as righteous and untouchable. For corporations and public figures conscious of public opinion, that alignment carried its own value. Some critics went further, suggesting that influential donors weren't only propping up the McCanns, but also indirectly influencing the tone of the investigation. While there is no concrete evidence that donors interfered directly with police work, their financial power undeniably offered the family a level of protection from the scrutiny typically faced by suspects in comparable cases. Media outlets softened their coverage. Critics were labeled harsh or insensitive, and dissenting voices, including those of Portuguese investigators, were often sidelined. Meanwhile, the optics served not just the McCanns, but also the British government. The image of the UK actively supporting two of its own citizens played well on the world stage, becoming a kind of diplomatic narrative. This is how we look after our people abroad. These dynamics do not prove corruption, but they highlight a troubling question. How much of justice is shaped by money, and how much by media choreography? When powerful voices concentrate on a single case, they may believe they are helping, but their influence can narrow the lens so tightly that everything else fades from view. In September 2007, more than 4 months after 3-year-old Madeleine disappeared, her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, were formally declared arguidos, official suspects, by Portuguese police. The designation shocked the public and deepened the scrutiny of a case already receiving global attention. At the core of this move was a forensic controversy that later divided experts and undermined public confidence. Investigators in Portugal believed that DNA evidence found in a car rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine vanished linked back to her. A sample from the car's boot was reported to show 15 out of 19 genetic markers consistent with her profile. Initially regarded as a possible breakthrough, the UK's Forensic Science Service later concluded that the sample was too complex to be interpreted with certainty. In practical terms, this meant the DNA could neither conclusively confirm nor rule out a connection. Despite this, Portuguese investigators treated the evidence as significant, reinforcing their theory that Madeleine may have died in the apartment and that her body was later transported in the rental car. Adding to suspicion was Kate McCann's decision to decline answering 48 questions during an 11-hour police interview in early September 2007. Though legally within her rights, her silence added to the unease among investigators
and was seized upon by tabloids. By contrast, Gerry McCann answered all the questions posed to him. To the Portuguese police, Kate's silence suggested avoidance, even though her legal advisors had recommended it due to the nature of the questioning. Despite the media frenzy, no substantial case materialized. In July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors lifted the arguido status of both parents, citing a lack of conclusive evidence. In the years since, UK authorities and major media outlets have repeatedly stated that there is no credible basis to believe the parents were involved in their daughter's disappearance. The media, however, had already shaped perceptions. In the early days, British tabloids focused on superficial behavioral cues, such as Kate McCann's limited public displays of emotion, as though these could indicate guilt. These narratives fed harmful stereotypes about how grieving mothers are supposed to behave, overlooking the psychological toll such trauma can inflict. Over time, skepticism began to shift towards sympathy, particularly as the McCanns pursued defamation lawsuits. In 2008, they won £55,000 from Express newspapers over false and defamatory articles, followed by another £55,000 settlement from the Sunday Times in 2013. These victories underscored how damaging misleading coverage had been. From the start, the British government had been unusually proactive. Within hours of Madeleine's disappearance, the British Embassy in Lisbon had contacted Portuguese authorities. The Foreign Office assigned officials to assist the McCanns, a level of diplomatic involvement rarely extended to other missing child cases involving British citizens abroad. By 2011, the government escalated its commitment with Operation Grange, a Scotland Yard reinvestigation of the case. To date, it has cost more than £13.2 million, more than any other missing child investigation in British history. Officially, the operation's purpose was to re-examine the circumstances of Madeleine's disappearance. Unofficially, critics argued it was also about restoring public faith in British institutions and salvaging national image. Some even suggested the UK applied diplomatic pressure on Portugal to lift the McCanns' arguido status in 2008, despite no fresh evidence of innocence emerging. In October 2023, after 16 years of uncertainty, Portuguese authorities issued a rare public apology to the McCann family. They admitted critical mistakes had been made in the early stages: failure to secure the crime scene properly, failure to prioritize missing child protocols, and insufficient consideration for the McCanns as foreigners navigating an unfamiliar justice system. For some, this apology was a step towards reconciliation. For others, it raised questions about timing and substance, as it did little to change the stagnant trajectory of the investigation. Even with their arguido status lifted as far back as 2008, Kate and Gerry McCann have continued to live under the shadow of suspicion. The 2023 apology may have brought some emotional relief, but it could not erase years of public mistrust, judicial uncertainty, and inconsistent narratives from both police and media. The case remains an uneasy reminder of how visibility, privilege, and influence can alter the path of justice, for better or worse. The failure to fully clear the McCanns, in the eyes of the global public, highlights a much broader problem: the difficulty of securing justice and clarity when media influence, political interests, and uncertain forensic findings collide. Officially, they are no longer suspects, but they are also not entirely free from judgment. Their experience exposes deep fractures in international cooperation, the ethics of media coverage, and the interpretation of forensic evidence. More importantly, it reveals the lasting cost of unresolved suspicion when definitive truth is absent. For a family that began this ordeal seeking answers, the burden of doubt has become one of the most enduring injustices. In the history of modern true crime, few cases have drawn such relentless public attention as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Yet, beyond the headlines and emotional appeals lies a difficult truth. The line between public forgiveness and legal exoneration is not only blurred, but often deliberately shaped by perception. When Kate and Gerry McCann were formally declared arguidos by Portuguese police, the decision rested on circumstantial and inconclusive forensic evidence, including a DNA sample from a rental car that some experts claimed showed partial similarity to Madeleine's profile. The UK's Forensic Science Service later dismissed the sample as too complex to interpret with certainty. Even so, Portuguese authorities pressed forward with their theory that Madeleine may have died in the apartment and that her remains were later moved. Compounding suspicion was Kate McCann's choice to remain silent during 48 of the questions posed in an 11-hour interrogation. While she was legally entitled to do so, her silence, in contrast to Gerry's full cooperation, was portrayed in the media as evasive. The result was a storm of speculation, where tabloid headlines and amateur theories blurred the line between investigation and character judgment. By July 2008, however, the McCann's arguido status was lifted due to insufficient evidence. Yet this was not a declaration of innocence. There was no formal ruling that cleared them. Instead, the legal system stepped back, unable to proceed, but unwilling or unable to close the matter. Into that vacuum stepped a powerful PR strategy, supported by a willing media. Through the efforts of Clarence Mitchell, the family repositioned themselves from potential suspects to symbols of victims mistreated by institutions and unfairly vilified by the press. Media outlets that had once fueled suspicion began apologizing and paying settlements. Express newspapers issued £55,000 in damages for defamatory coverage, followed by the Sunday Times in 2013 with another £55,000 settlement. These legal victories protected the family's reputation and signaled to the public that sentiment had shifted. Yet, here lies the paradox. While the McCanns were increasingly viewed as blameless in the court of public opinion, they were never formally exonerated in a court of law. This unresolved gap has continued to divide opinion. In effect, the media narrative closed the case, but the legal system did not. This dynamic, where media consensus replaces judicial clarity, raises profound questions. What happens when headlines substitute for verdicts? In the McCann case, it created what some describe as extrajudicial rehabilitation, social forgiveness granted without legal confirmation. The consequences of this are significant. For the McCanns, the absence of formal exoneration means suspicion still lingers. For their critics, it means their concerns feel unanswered. For the justice system, it marks a failure to assert its authority, ceding ground to public relations and media framing. And for society at large, it sets a precedent where perception risks overtaking fact. The psychological cost of this ambiguity should not be underestimated. In matters of criminal justice, clarity is vital. Families, victims, and the public all need resolution, whether through conviction, acquittal, or clear closure. When the media provides that sense of closure without a legal basis, it destabilizes both institutional credibility and the emotional lives of those involved. The McCanns may have been shielded from public condemnation by the press, but they were never shielded from the uncertainty left behind by the justice system. This case shows just how strongly media influence can distort the balance of justice. Unlike courts, the press is not bound by evidentiary standards. It can pivot its narrative, sometimes for commercial or political reasons, rehabilitating individuals as easily as it can condemn them. But when media narratives begin to act as substitutes for judicial outcomes, society risks losing its shared understanding of truth. This has implications beyond this case. If public relations campaigns can soften or overwrite legal ambiguity, will it become expected that every family in a high-profile investigation must hire a spokesperson? Will justice come to depend on the ability to manage perception rather than evidence? And will the public continue to confuse compelling storytelling with proven truth? The Madeleine McCann case is therefore more than a story of a missing child. It is a cautionary tale about how guilt and innocence are processed. It reveals how narratives are built, contested, and sometimes concluded outside the courtroom. Kate and Gerry McCann may never face formal charges, and they may never receive an official legal declaration of innocence. Yet in the eyes of much of the public, influenced by media framing and emotional appeals, they have already been forgiven. Forgiven, yes, but never formally cleared. In that gap between perception and procedure lies a silence that still echoes. The silence of a case unresolved, and of a justice system whose authority was overtaken by headlines. Growing attention has also turned to the financial mechanisms behind the investigation, particularly Madeleine's fund. Leaving no stone unturned, a private non-profit company created just 12 days after her disappearance. Intended to support the search, its legal structure and lack of oversight have provoked serious concerns about transparency and accountability. From its inception, the fund was registered as a limited company rather than a charity. This distinction is crucial. Because it focused on a single individual, it did not qualify for charitable status under UK law, and thus was not subject to oversight by the Charity Commission. Without this scrutiny, it operated under less stringent reporting requirements. More concerning still was the composition of the board, which included Kate and Gerry McCann, alongside close friends and associates. While understandable on an emotional level, the lack of independent oversight raised obvious conflicts of interest. Decisions about how funds were spent remained internal, with little external accountability. Early financial reporting only deepened concerns. In its first year of operation, no detailed accounting was made public. It was not until after the 2007 to 2008 fiscal year that financial reports were released, showing large sums already spent on private investigators, legal fees, PR campaigns, and even contributions towards the McCann's mortgage. For many donors, this delayed transparency undermined confidence in the fund's integrity. It prompted proposals for reform to ensure better governance in future cases. Suggestions included stricter rules limiting the use of donations to purposes directly related to investigations, mandatory quarterly financial reports detailing income and expenditure, independent boards, including auditors, legal advisors, and public representatives to ensure objectivity, and holding such funds to the same standards of transparency and accountability as registered charities, even when they do not qualify as charities under law. The creation of a new regulatory category for public interest private funds could address many of the concerns raised by the Madeleine McCann case, ensuring that such funds are subject to proper oversight, even when they fall outside traditional charity definitions. These reforms are not only about technical compliance, but about safeguarding public confidence in the integrity of grassroots initiatives that support justice and humanitarian causes. Alongside financial reform, structural changes to the investigative process are urgently needed. The McCann case, now spanning almost 2 decades, has been characterized by poor communication and limited coordination between Portuguese, British, and German authorities. The lack of a unified strategy has led to missed opportunities, conflicting narratives, and growing public confusion. International politics and opaque prosecutorial decisions have only deepened this uncertainty. In recent years, German prosecutors have identified Christian Bruckner as the prime suspect. Yet despite public statements suggesting they hold evidence linking him to Madeleine's fate, they have repeatedly refused to disclose the nature of that evidence. This lack of transparency has fueled skepticism and allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, with critics suggesting that political or diplomatic interests may be shaping the direction of the investigation. Operation Grange, the British Review launched in 2011, has also faced criticism. With over 13.2 million spent and no definitive outcome, many question whether the resources have been effectively managed. The absence of clear results has eroded public faith in the justice system's ability to resolve the case and to work effectively across borders. One proposed solution has been the creation of an independent international commission, free from the influence of any single government. Such a body, composed of experts from neutral countries like Sweden, Canada, or Australia, could bring a fresh perspective. Forensic specialists, criminal investigators, and human rights lawyers could reassess the case without the weight of political pressure. Crucially, they would need full access to all existing files and evidence, including forensic samples, phone records, and investigative reports from both the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária and Operation Grange. With modern forensic science far more advanced than in 2007, previously inconclusive DNA samples could be retested using higher sensitivity methods. Artificial intelligence could also be applied to behavioral analysis, travel data, and communication records, uncovering links or anomalies that manual reviews may have missed. The McCann case highlights not only investigative shortcomings, but also systemic failures in financial accountability and intergovernmental cooperation. Reforming the governance of private funds and establishing an independent investigative commission are not just logical measures, but moral imperatives. Without them, future cases risk falling into the same traps: delayed justice, eroded trust, and truths that remain out of reach. One of the most troubling aspects of this case is its seemingly endless timeline. Nearly 20 years have passed, yet there is still no definitive outcome. This lack of structure has bred frustration among the public. Each new phase of funding without visible progress fuels the perception of a never-ending inquiry. To rebuild confidence, clear frameworks must be introduced. Authorities should be required to publish regular updates, ideally on a quarterly basis, detailing what leads have been pursued, which suspects are under review, and what technical or legal challenges are being encountered. These updates should be accessible to the public via a neutral international platform such as Interpol's website or a dedicated independent portal. Just as important is the introduction of formal time limits. Investigations of this scale and visibility could be capped at 2 to 3 years of active work, after which the case must either reach a conclusion, transition to cold case status, or be declared at a legal impasse. In such cases, authorities should provide a detailed explanation of what prevented closure and whether any future avenues remain open. This approach would provide clarity, reduce speculation, and help prevent mistrust from taking root. Without these reforms, investigations risk becoming self-perpetuating, absorbing public funds while lacking clear benchmarks. By introducing both regular disclosures and finite timelines, law enforcement could reinforce the integrity of their work and offer some measure of closure to a global audience still waiting for answers. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann sparked one of the most extensive and costly investigations in modern history. Yet as time passed and speculation grew, the case became a broader narrative about imbalance, selective justice, and the invisible influence of privilege. At its heart lies not only the tragedy of a missing child, but also a cautionary story about how wealth, class, and political connections can shape the systems we trust to be impartial. From the outset, Kate and Gerry McCann benefited from resources and protections far beyond the reach of most families. As two middle-class doctors, they were quickly embraced by the media as sympathetic figures. Within hours, the British government had intervened diplomatically, a remarkable step reflecting both their status and their access to influence. Their ability to secure legal teams, PR advisors, and private investigators placed them in a position that countless other families searching for missing loved ones could never attain. Operation Grange, with its more than £13.2 million in funding, symbolizes this extraordinary support. Yet despite its scale, it has failed to provide closure. Meanwhile, thousands of other cases remain in silence, their families left with little more than words of sympathy and minimal institutional support. The McCann case illustrates a dangerous precedent, that justice can be amplified or diminished depending on media appeal, public relations strategy, and political interest. The sheer volume of resources devoted to one case, while so many others received almost none, exposes the uncomfortable truth of an unequal system. This is not to suggest that the McCanns did not deserve support, but rather to question why other families were denied the same. Ben Needham, who disappeared in 1991 on the Greek island of Kos, was also a British child. Yet his family received only minimal government backing, no global media campaigns, and no multi-million-pound investigations. The contrast could not be more stark. Similarly, the case of 8-year-old Joana Cipriano, a Portuguese girl who vanished just a few miles from Praia da Luz, never stood a chance of capturing media sympathy. Her mother, Leonor, was convicted in a trial riddled with inconsistencies and claims of police misconduct. She had no access to high-profile lawyers, no spokespersons, and no national campaigns urging the public to remember her daughter. Her words, "The only difference between our family and the McCanns is that we don't have money," remain both heartbreaking and deeply revealing. Even the handling of evidence in the McCann case seemed to reflect this imbalance. DNA traces discovered in the family's rental car, initially reported as consistent with Madeleine's profile, were ultimately dismissed as inconclusive. When Kate McCann declined to answer 48 police questions during interrogation, the decision was rationalized, not condemned. Actions that might have been devastating for a less affluent or less connected family were quickly excused in this instance, forgiven by public opinion long before the justice system had delivered its verdict. The conclusion is difficult, but necessary. Justice in the McCann case did not unfold in isolation. It operated within a system that appeared to respond more readily to status than to substance. It was shaped not only by forensic leads and investigative work, but also by press conferences, diplomatic interventions, and carefully orchestrated media strategies. And it is here that the deepest injustice emerges. Justice should never be reserved for those with influence. It should not be accessible only through connections, nor strengthened by social standing. True justice must be blind to privilege, impartial in its pursuit, and equally available to all. When it is seen to be selective, its legitimacy collapses. When the system appears to elevate some and neglect others, it loses the trust of those it exists to serve. The McCann case should mark a turning point, not a precedent. It must force us to ask, who gets to be heard, whose pain is recognized, and why do some lives appear to matter more than others in the public eye? The answers cannot depend on appearance, profession, or the ability to hire a spokesperson. Reforms are needed. Reforms that enforce transparency, equality, and accountability. Every family searching for a missing loved one deserves the same level of commitment, the same resources, and the same determination from authorities. Only then can we begin to restore faith in a system that has for too long been shaped by privilege. Justice, by its very nature, must not only be done, but be seen to be done. And in a world where perception so often overshadows truth, we must ensure that justice is not reserved for the powerful, but for all. For if justice depends on privilege, then it is no justice at all. Now let me ask you, do you believe the way Madeleine's case was handled reveals a system that bends too easily to influence? Should justice ever depend on wealth, status, or media appeal, or must it be rebuilt on fairness, equality, and transparency for every family who faces such tragedy?